Hey everyone, my name's Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. Today, I'm going to answer a reader question about emotional maturity. A reader asks, Dear Nick, I just got out of an unhealthy relationship with a man who, in hindsight, was clearly emotionally immature. The breakup has been rough, but the thing that's really got me down is that this is the third time I've gotten involved with someone like this, had my heart broken, and swore I'd never do it again. I feel like I'm just broken and incapable of avoiding this pattern, but I have to believe I can break out of it. Any suggestions for identifying emotionally immature men, or anyone, I guess, early before it gets so hard to leave? Yes, I have a ton of suggestions for you. Specifically, I have 7 emotional red flags to watch out for in a potential partner. And we'll get to these in a second. But before we do that, I want to encourage you a little bit. First of all, you're very self-aware, I think, about this process. You've identified that there is this pattern that you're stuck in. And I think you even have the intuition that even though it feels like you'll stay stuck in this pattern, it should be possible to break free of it. And I'm going to tell you, it absolutely is. I've worked with a lot of people who've had similar issues like this and similar histories of feeling stuck in this rut. And they have, with some work and some patience, been able to break free from this cycle. And you definitely can too. But to do it, you're going to need to do 2 things in particular, I think. The first one is you're going to have to do some real reflection and soul searching about what need these emotionally immature men fill in you. Now, I say that because the way to think about it is there's some emotional, psychological need in you. And despite their long-term costs, men like this are they're filling that need for you. The thing is, if you do some reflection and figure out what that need actually is, you will be able to eventually find some healthier alternative ways to get that need met. And when you do, you won't feel such a strong attraction to emotionally immature men like this. So that's the first thing. There's a lot of ways you can do this. You can do it on your own by, journaling or meditating on it. You can do it in a series of conversations with a trusted friend or partner. You could even do it professionally with a therapist or a counselor or a coach or something like that. But the point is, this is not like a quickie once and done thing. You're going to have to spend some serious time and commit to some regular work to really, again, reflect on and figure out what is this need in me that emotionally immature men like this are filling. Okay, so that's the first thing. The next thing, and this is more the topic of this video, is you want to get good at identifying these signs of emotional maturity early so that you don't get overly invested in the relationship and then have it be, like you described, this really rough, brutal process of getting yourself out of this unhealthy relationship. Now, the thing you should know about these things up front is that they are not quick fixes. There's no way you will be able to identify in the first 5 minutes, the first day, the first week, even the first month maybe of getting to know someone, whether these patterns in them exist, whether these signs or red flags exist. It's going to take some time. You are going to have to get to know them. But here's the key thing. Just because you need time to get to know someone doesn't mean you have to get incredibly emotionally invested in them. This is a really hard thing to do. We find someone we like and we go all in, right? We dive in, we invest all of ourselves into them in that relationship. And while that's okay if it works out, if the person is worthy of all that investment, often they're not. We just don't have enough information to know whether they aren't or not. So the trick here is to be willing to slow down and keep the relationship casual for a while. You don't have to go super deep, super quickly. And what that does is it gives you some runway. It gives you some time to figure out, is this person emotionally mature enough, among other things, to be in a long-term relationship with? That said, let's look at 7 emotional red flags in a romantic partner, signs that they might be emotionally immature and therefore not worthy of a long-term relationship with you. Number 1, conflict avoidance. Conflict in relationships is unavoidable, obviously. But the degree to which people are willing to confront that conflict and work through it in a healthy way, it says a lot about their level of emotional maturity. Now, most people hear the word conflict and they think of big, huge examples of conflict, yelling and screaming, fights, maybe even physical abuse or violence, right? And while that certainly does happen, it's not all that common. The much more common type of conflict, and honestly, the type that's easier to overlook, is far subtler and smaller in a sense. So it could be things like a difficult conversation about money and spending habits, or disagreements about how to manage a relationship with someone who's part of your partner's extended family, or even something honestly as simple as whether to have Italian or Chinese food for dinner tonight. But because most people really don't like conflict, their natural instinct is to avoid it at all costs. But if you think about it, this is really just a form of procrastination. In the moment, because it's uncomfortable, you're saying, no, I'll do it later. So you're trading some short-term relief, I don't have to deal with this problem, for the long-term pain of later on having to deal with the problem when it's probably gotten a lot bigger and a lot more complex and therefore harder to deal with. You don't want to get into a relationship with someone who procrastinates on important issues just because they're afraid of conflict. Let's take a simple example of how even relatively minor conflict avoidance can lead to much bigger problems in the relationship. Suppose you're dating someone, and anytime you even mention hanging out with your friends, your partner gets unusually quiet and tense. They seem a little stressed out. Now, maybe you ask them, hey, is everything okay? And they say, oh, no, everything's fine. But something about them, their behavior, their mood, their method of communication, it sort of signals to you, something's not so okay. What's key to see here is that it's very possible that they do have some sort of an issue with your friends. However, for whatever reason, they're afraid to bring it up with you, right? Maybe it's because they're afraid of it leading to an argument, or they think you'll get mad and upset, or maybe even they're worried that you will break off the whole relationship and they'll lose the relationship because of this one thing. So they essentially procrastinate on dealing with it. They tell themselves, they tell you, it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal, it's fine. And things go on. Now, as this pattern continues, you probably continue to check in and see if everything's okay. Do you want to talk about this? Is something wrong? Maybe even ask them point blank, hey, do you not like my friends, or does something about them bother you? And they continue to say, oh no, everything's fine. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. Now, as a result of this tension, think about it. There's going to be a lot of resentment that starts to grow. For one thing, you're going to more and more start resenting your partner because it seems like they're not being totally honest with you. Maybe you don't know for sure, but you're getting more and more evidence that obviously something is bothering them and they're not sharing it. Similarly, they're going to start to feel resentful, partly of themselves because they know they should be more honest about that, but they're procrastinating and avoiding it. But also even, and no matter how irrational this is, they might resent you. A lot of people have things go through their head like, well, they should know. I shouldn't have to say it. They should just know that their friends stress me out. And so again, no matter how irrational these things are, these sorts of resentments can build and build and build when people avoid conflict, when they procrastinate on bringing up difficult issues because they're afraid of potential conflict. And then finally, as this pattern keeps going and the resentment and frustrations and fears keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it only gets harder and harder for that person to actually speak up until they get to the point where it almost feels hopeless. Like that, I just can't ever bring this up. And then that's where things really get dangerous because it becomes a huge issue that someone has totally given up on dealing with. And that is really potentially unhealthy for the relationship. As with any form of procrastination, conflict avoidance creates a lot of long-term pain and suffering for a little bit of present emotional relief. This is why it's critical to find a partner who's willing to approach conflict instead of avoiding it. And not only is it a sign of emotional maturity, but if you think about it, it's a sign that they really value the relationship. Or flip it around and think about it like this. When someone chronically avoids conflict, what that means is they value their own feelings more than they value the relationship. On the other hand, when you have a partner who's willing to endure the discomfort of approaching conflict and leaning into it, that signals something really important about their priorities, their values, and ultimately their level of emotional maturity. Number 2, reassurance seeking. Reassurance seeking is a coping mechanism where people avoid their own difficult emotions by reflexively going to other people for comfort and relief. For example, anytime your boyfriend, let's say, gets criticized at work, he immediately calls you up to, quote unquote, talk him off the ledge. Or another example, anytime you and your girlfriend get out of a fight, she immediately texts her therapist or coach and asks them what she should do. Of course, turning to other people for emotional support is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a key part of emotional health and well-being overall. But the devil's in the details. Specifically, how you use emotional support makes all the difference. It's one thing if, after feeling really upset, your partner slows down and takes some time on their own to think through and reflect and process what happened, how they're feeling, what they're experiencing, what they actually want to do. And then, after having done that work themselves, then they go to someone else for some additional support or advice or encouragement, something like that. In other words, emotionally mature people take responsibility for their own emotions. So while they may eventually look to other people for some additional support and guidance, their first instinct is always to process and work through things themselves, taking responsibility and ownership for their own interior lives. Now, on the other hand, people who are chronic reassurance seekers, they often have an implicit belief that ultimately how they feel is up to or the responsibility of other people. And this leads them into this habit of anytime they start to feel bad, their first reaction is to go right to somebody else. Put another way, reassurance seeking means outsourcing your emotional health and well-being to other people. And unsurprisingly, this habit of reassurance seeking and outsourcing your emotional health to other people, it doesn't go well in the long run. For one thing, the person doing the reassurance seeking, it's not doing them any favors long term, because ultimately, like all coping mechanisms, it's an avoidance strategy. They're avoiding the real problem, which is they need to work through this emotional issue that they have. And instead, they're just throwing it on somebody else. But even longer term for them, by avoiding dealing with the emotional issue themselves and outsourcing it to somebody else, they're lowering their confidence, which means they're going to get more and more insecure and less confident that they can have emotional difficulties and work through them on their own, which means they're going to have more and more of a need to outsource this stuff, to do more and more reassurance seeking. And you can see how this turns into a really vicious cycle of reassurance seeking, insecurity, more reassurance seeking, insecurity, round and round we go. But reassurance seeking is also dangerous for the relationship because it leads the other person in the relationship to feel used, which makes sense if you think about it. Just like we all resent being used for our money or our connections or anything else, we also resent being used for our emotional support and empathy. And having a romantic partner who relies and depends on us for their emotional health and well-being is a setup for resentment and a really unhealthy relationship. So pay really close attention to how a potential partner handles their own difficult emotions. Do they take responsibility for them and try to work through them on their own in a good faith way? Or do they immediately avoid those difficult emotions and outsource them to somebody else? Number 3, defensiveness. Defensiveness is another coping strategy where we attack or criticize someone else in order to shift the focus off of our own insecurities or faults. For example, let's say you confront your partner about their concerning money tendencies and spending habits, and they immediately criticize you back for being too cheap or too tightly wound. Maybe something really simple, like you ask your partner to take out the trash, and they immediately criticize you back for not doing other things around the house that they asked you to do. Defensiveness is unhealthy in a relationship because it cuts people off from feedback and growth. You can think about it like this. Obviously, no relationship is perfect, right? There's always going to be areas for growth and improvement. And if your partner isn't willing to grow and change and take feedback well, that does not bode very well for the overall health of the relationship. It's very at risk to either just kind of stagnate or even fall apart entirely. Now, before we go on to talk more about defensiveness, there's a really key distinction we need to make, and that is feeling defensive is very different than acting defensive. Everybody feels defensive when they get criticized or when they have they're given some tough feedback or they have a flaw pointed out. It's incredibly normal. Nothing could be more human. It's also incredibly normal when we feel any kind of pain, including the emotional pain that comes from tough feedback or criticism, we tend to avoid it. We don't like pain, right? It's very, very natural, again. And unfortunately, one of the ways we learn, often at a young age, to avoid pain, including emotional pain, is to hurt back or to point out someone else's flaws. This is the heart of defensiveness. But just because you have the impulse to hurt back, to act defensively, doesn't mean you have to. Right? This is something most little kids learn eventually, that when their friend steals their toy, it's not okay to hit them back, right? They figure out some other way of dealing with that problem. They go to an adult for help or something like that, right? And theoretically, most adults learn something similar, that when they get hurt, there are better ways to handle that than just attacking the other person back. Unfortunately, that's not true for everybody, and it's not true for everybody in all situations. Some people, if they're low on emotional maturity, they continue to rely on this relatively primitive coping mechanism, which is when they get hurt, the way they handle it is to hurt back. That's acting out your defensiveness. So, while you never want to judge your partner for feeling defensive, it is very important to be aware of and assess how much they act out their defensiveness. Specifically, if they have a pattern of anytime you give a good faith criticism or feedback, they tend to lash out and criticize you and point out your flaws and faults, that suggests a serious lack of emotional maturity. On the other hand, even if your partner is visibly upset after you giving them some feedback or criticism, if they're willing to sit with that and respectfully acknowledge it and try to work through it, that's a very good sign that they have a relatively high level of emotional maturity. Number 4, low assertiveness. Assertiveness is the willingness to ask for what you want or express yourself in a way that's honest to your own wants and needs and also respectful of the other person. For example, a guy tells his girlfriend that he would rather not go out to the party and just stay in tonight, even though he suspects she might be a little bit upset. Or a woman asks her partner to watch her kids on Saturday morning so that she can have coffee with a good friend, despite the fact that it will interfere with her partner's weekly golf game. Now, sadly, a lot of people are not willing to be assertive, are not willing to express themselves and ask for what they really want because they're afraid of making someone feel bad. They're afraid of triggering someone else to emotionally feel discomfort, right? So in the case of the first example above, instead of telling his girlfriend that he actually doesn't want to go to the party, he just decides to, go with the flow and do it anyway, despite the fact that he doesn't want to. Or in the example of the woman, she decides to reschedule her coffee date and have to move around about 14 other appointments because she doesn't want to be a burden to her partner. When people are unwilling to be assertive, they're sacrificing their legitimate wants and needs because they're afraid of how someone else might feel. Of course, there's nothing wrong with sacrificing your own wants and needs sometimes. The problem is, like all of these red flags, when they become a pattern, when someone becomes so uncomfortable doing something differently that they essentially get addicted to it. And a lot of people are addicted to, quote unquote, going with the flow, staying quiet, not speaking up and asking for what they actually want or expressing themselves. Now, there are about 427 different reasons why this is terrible for the person who can't be assertive, but it's also terrible for the relationship. Because while superficially it's kind of nice to be in a relationship like this with someone who is always deferring to you and never doing anything to quote unquote rock the boat, right? It's kind of nice, but it's actually deadly for the relationship long term because it's hard to be assertive in big things if you're unwilling to practice being assertive in small things. For example, suppose your partner is really unhappy in their job and actually their whole career, and secretly they want to quit their job and go back to school and change careers. But they're terrified of being assertive and actually sharing this with you because they have a lot of insecurity about money and they're really terrified of sort of being a financial burden on you. Now, if you think about it, how could this person possibly work up the courage to be assertive in this really big thing, a career change, when they're not even willing to be assertive about meeting a friend for coffee? People who can't be assertive always end up unhappy, usually some form of anxiety or depression. And that unhappiness eventually affects everybody connected to the relationship. If you want your relationship to be happy, you should want your partner to be happy, but they won't be if they're afraid of being assertive. Number 5, gaslighting. Gaslighting means manipulating someone else into thinking they're crazy or emotionally unstable, often by sowing the seeds of self-doubt. Of course, there are very extreme versions of this. In fact, in the movie from which we get this term, one of the main characters sort of tricks or manipulates one of the other characters into thinking that she's crazy and hallucinating. But typically, gaslighting is less extreme and not even necessarily done maliciously or as a form of manipulation. For example, after a guy describes a particularly anxiety-inducing day at work, for example, his girlfriend immediately criticizes him, telling him, "Oh, it's all in your head. Like, why are you still worrying about that?" Or in response to a partner opening up about an old insecurity about money, for example, the other partner immediately comes back with, "Oh, you're still worried about that? That was 30 years ago. Grow up." In other words, the less extreme, but far more common version of gaslighting is when someone criticizes you for how you feel emotionally. And even when it's done out of habit rather than malice, it's still terrible for the relationship because it kills trust. And this makes sense if you think about it. If every time you bring up a difficult feeling, your partner immediately criticizes it or you for feeling that way, you're going to stop bringing that stuff up. But when either person stops sharing, generally in a relationship, especially something as important as how they're feeling, it leads to a serious loss of intimacy and closeness and trust overall. So even if they're not doing it intentionally, be very careful of people who have a habit of criticizing you for how you feel emotionally. Emotionally mature people, on the other hand, understand that emotions are not under our direct control, which means they're not good or bad any more than the weather is good or bad. Rain is not good or bad, right? It's just a thing. It's just rain because it's not something we can control. And as a result, while they might criticize a specific behavior in us, because behaviors are things we can control and therefore they can be good or bad, they never criticize an emotion. So be very attentive to how a potential partner treats your emotions. And if they treat them as something bad or criticize you for them, that's a serious red flag and a sign of low emotional maturity. Number 6, poor boundaries. Boundaries are the flip side of assertiveness. If assertiveness means asking for what you want honestly and respectfully of the other person, boundaries mean saying no to what you don't want in a way that is similarly honest to your own wants and needs and also respectful of other people. In a relationship, healthy boundaries might look like, for example, you ask your boyfriend to go for a hike with you early on Saturday morning. And he says, thanks, but no thanks. I had a really stressful week and I think I just need to relax. Or in a bigger example, maybe your partner tells you that if you guys do get married, she is not willing to move out of state because it's very important to her to live near her family. Now, crucially, while boundaries can be very hard to hear, and while you're not under any obligation to accept someone else's boundaries, in general, they tend to make relationships work a lot more smoothly because what good boundaries mean on both sides is that people are being honest with each other. And a relationship is always much more likely to thrive when people are able and willing to be honest. On the other hand, unhealthy boundaries, right, or the lack of boundaries, while they don't seem like a big deal initially, they can end up wreaking havoc on a relationship for the same reasons that low assertiveness or conflict avoidance can, right? And that is resentment builds up. So eventually, suppose, your boyfriend just agrees to go hiking because, he feels uncomfortable setting that boundary with you, saying no to you. So he does it anyway, right? And this keeps happening. Every, week or two, you ask him and he's like, yeah, sure. Now what happens is you start imagining, yeah, he likes hiking. My boyfriend loves hiking, right? Because understandably, he always says yes. But then at some point, this becomes so much of a problem for your boyfriend, either because resentment has built up or he just really hates doing this and it just becomes too much and it blows up and it becomes a huge thing. And you are understandably super upset because basically he's been lying to you for so long. So not only does this conflict become huge and big and hard to handle, but it also lowers intimacy and trust. Because again, understandably, they've essentially been lying to you because they're not willing to tell you that they really don't want to do something. They're not willing to set a boundary with you. So to kind of sum all this up, the willingness to set and enforce healthy boundaries is important in a relationship because it's important for people to be happy in a relationship. And people can't be happy if they're not getting their legitimate wants and needs met on a regular basis. And a big part of that is not just asking for what you want, but being willing, even when it's emotionally difficult, to say no to what you don't want. Now, here's a final thought I'll leave you with to kind of chew on with this topic about boundaries. To set and enforce a healthy boundary means that a person respects themselves enough to do the right thing even when it's difficult emotionally. On the other hand, a person who rarely sets boundaries or sets them but then doesn't enforce them and kind of gives up on them, what that says is they don't respect themselves enough and they don't have enough emotional strength to do the right thing even though it's difficult. And it's very, very hard to have a healthy relationship with someone who doesn't have a healthy relationship with themselves. Number 7, stonewalling. Stonewalling is a specific form of defensiveness that involves refusing to interact or communicate with someone in response to emotional pain or hurt or suffering. For example, after a big disagreement about holiday travel plans, for instance, a guy decides to give his girlfriend the silent treatment and avoids eye contact. It doesn't even talk to her for hours, maybe even days. Or maybe in response to a guy's insensitive comment about her friends, a woman decides to ignore her partner by constantly being busy, working late, not responding to texts, that type of thing. Now, frequently, the intent behind stonewalling is a form of manipulation where the person doing the stonewalling makes the relationship so uncomfortable. There's so much tension and friction that eventually the other person gets so uncomfortable, so anxious, so insecure maybe, that they'll kind of do anything to get things back to the way they were. Of course, this dynamic of stonewalling followed by appeasement doesn't really work long-term for the relationship. While it may give some temporary short-term relief, stonewalling creates a dangerous precedent of avoiding difficult issues or discussions about problems in favor of this kind of manipulative, passive-aggressive form of communication. So, like any form of defensiveness, stonewalling is an unhealthy coping mechanism designed to avoid emotional pain. And if the person you're dating has to rely on such an unhealthy mechanism to deal with their own difficult emotions, that is a very strong sign of low emotional maturity. Now, if you've just listened to me describe all 7 of these emotional red flags, you will have probably noticed that they are all surprisingly similar in a lot of ways. And the reason for that, it's not an accident. It's because they are all manifestations of the same underlying deficit, the same lack of skill. And that is, emotionally immature people have an unhealthy relationship with their own emotions, especially fear. Think about it. Why do people avoid conflict? Because they can't manage their fear of what might happen as a result of the conflict. Why do people use reassurance seeking? Because they can't manage their own anxiety and fear and outsource it to other people. Why do people act defensively? Because they can't or don't know how to deal with their own fears and insecurities, and so they deflect and criticize other people. So we can see what makes a person emotionally immature is their inability and or unwillingness to deal with their own difficult emotions in a healthy way. And as a result, they manage them in a really unhealthy way, using a lot of coping mechanisms that just leads to them being miserable and unhappy, but also tends to create a lot of conflict and strife in the relationship. So when you're dating someone or interviewing them for the job of being a long-term romantic partner with you, the single most important thing you can do is to assess what is this person's relationship with difficult emotions, especially their own. How do they handle them? What do they do when things get tough? That will tell you almost everything you need to know about their level of emotional maturity and is a big part of whether you ought to consider them for a long-term romantic partner. Now, before we wrap up, I want you to keep 3 really important things in mind. The first is patterns, not points. That is, all of these things, these red flags, we all do these sometimes. Everybody does. The most emotionally mature person in the world falls into some of these sometimes. I certainly do it, and I talk about this constantly for a living. So what matters is not, did they do it one time? Oh my God, they asked for reassurance once, or they kind of stonewalled me once. One single instance is not necessarily indicative of someone's overall emotional maturity. What matters is, what's the pattern? And if they have these red flags, if these red flags show up in a consistent way, that is a serious red flag. Number 2, awareness and willingness. Now, even if someone has one of these patterns, if they are aware of this pattern and they have demonstrated, not just said, but actually demonstrated through their behavior that they're willing to try and work on it and change and do something differently, that's a very different situation. Let's call that one a yellow flag. Third, these red flags actually apply beyond romance. We've been talking about them in the context of romantic relationships, but actually, I think they're really good things to keep in mind for any type of serious relationship, whether it's a business partner or a teacher or mentor, or even something like a coach or a therapist. If someone demonstrates a lot of these red flags consistently, they're a pattern and they don't seem very aware of it, or they don't seem willing to do anything about it, that is a really, really bad sign almost all the time. And you should really think a lot more carefully about getting seriously involved with someone like that. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you'd like to get more ideas from me about healthy relationships and emotional maturity and similar topics, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind that I send out every Monday morning, and you can subscribe to it at thefriendlymind.com.